Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really focusing in on a crucial piece of patent law, specifically from the MPEP, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure,
That's right. We're digging into Section 2133 today.
which falls under Chapter 2100, Patentability. And this section, 2133, it's all about Pre-AIA 35 U.S.C. Section 102B.
Exactly. It covers those statutory bars, things that could prevent you from getting a patent because of activities that happened before you filed. We're talking public disclosures, public use, putting the invention on sale.
Right, but specifically activities that happen more than 1 year before your filing date, under the old pre-AIA system.
Precisely. Think of it as the old one-year grace period. Our mission today is to unpack what that really meant. What actions could accidentally bar your patent? What were the timelines?
Okay, let's jump into that 1 year statutory bar. What's the absolute core principle here?
Well, the main idea of pre-AIA Section 102V is pretty clear, at least on the surface. If your invention was already patented somewhere, or more commonly described in a printed publication.
Like a journal article or maybe even a conference presentation?
Yes, exactly. Or if it was in public use or on sale here in the U.S., and this is the key part, more than 1 year before your effective U.S. filing date, then generally you couldn't get a patent on it.
So the law basically said you waited too long after putting it out there.
Pretty much. It was about encouraging inventors to file promptly once they, revealed their invention to the public in some way.
Can you give some concrete examples? What kind of actions would actually trigger this bar?
Sure. Publishing a detailed scientific paper fully describing the invention, that's a classic printed publication bar if it's more than a year before filing.
Makes sense.
Or, say, demonstrating your invention at a trade show, letting anyone use it without any confidentiality strings attached. That could be a public use bar.
And selling it.
Absolutely. Offering the invention for sale commercially, like taking orders or advertising it for sale, again, more than a year before you file your application, that's a potential on-sale bar.
It sounds like you had to be really careful.
You did. And it didn't always take much. There's a famous case, Egbert v. Lippmann.
Oh, yeah, the corset stays case, right?
That's the one. It showed that even a single instance of use by someone other than the inventor, without any obligation of secrecy, could count as a public use sufficient to bar the patent, even if it wasn't, widely known.
Wow. Okay, so that 1 year deadline is obviously critical. How is it calculated? Exactly 1 year.
It's exactly 1 year prior to the effective U.S. filing date. That effective date is important, especially with things like provisional applications or continuation applications.
But what happens if that critical date, the 1 year anniversary of the disclosure, falls on, say, a Saturday or a federal holiday when the USPTO is closed?
Good question. There's actually a specific rule for that. Under 35 U.S.C. Section 21B, and it's clarified in MPP Section 2147.
Okay.
If that last day, the 1 year anniversary, lands on a Saturday, Sunday, or a federal holiday in D.C., the deadline gets pushed to the next day, the USPTO is actually open for business.
So you get a little buffer if the timing works out that way.
Yes, exactly. And this also applies if the USPTO is unexpectedly closed for a whole day, maybe due to severe weather or something. That day is treated like a federal holiday for deadline purposes, too.
That's useful to know. Now, we mentioned publications, use, sales. Does the way the invention became public matter much? Is a journal article treated differently than, say, a public demonstration?
For the purpose of starting the clock under Section 102B, generally no. The key is whether the invention became accessible to the public more than a year before filing. Whether that access came via print or a sale or just unrestricted public use, the result is usually the same. The bar could apply.
So the focus is on public accessibility, not the specific medium.
Right. Could someone skilled in that field have learned about the invention from that disclosure or activity?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Okay, this is where it gets a bit more complex for me. What if the prior art the publication or use from more than a year ago doesn't describe my invention perfectly? What if mine has some improvements?
That's a really important point. The Section 102B bar isn't just about identical matches, what we call anticipation. It also covers obviousness.
Obviousness. How does that fit in here?
Well, key cases like Interfoster and Enriquez establish this. Even if the earlier disclosure doesn't show your exact invention, if that disclosure makes your claimed invention obvious to someone skilled in the art.
And that disclosure happened more than a year before you filed.
Then yes, that prior art can still trigger the Section 102B bar and prevent you from getting a patent, even for your arguably new version.
So you can't just take something that was public a year ago, make a small, obvious tweak, and expect to get a patent.
Not under this rule, no. The prior art existing before that critical date sets a baseline, and anything obvious over that baseline is also potentially barred if the baseline art qualifies under 102B.
Okay, that clarifies things. Now, what about different application types? How does this interact with, say, a continuation in part, a CIP application?
Ah, CIPs add another layer. Because a CIP, by definition, adds new matter that wasn't in the original parent application.
Right.
So, for claims in the CIP that rely only on that new matter, their effective filing date is the filing date of the CIP itself,
Which means,
which means any public disclosure, use, or sale of that specific new subject matter happening more than 1 year before the CIP's filing date could bar those claims under Section 102B.
but claims supported by the original parent application get the earlier date.
Correct. If a claim in the CIP finds full support in the parent disclosure, it gets the benefit of the parent's filing date for the Section 102B analysis. You have to look claim by claim.
That sounds like something you'd need to track very carefully. So what if you do get a Section 102B rejection? Is that game over, or can you fight it?
Definitely not always game over. There are ways to argue against it. The most direct way is to try and show that your claimed invention is actually patentably distinct, non-obvious over whatever was disclosed or used before the critical date.
So arguing the merits, basically, that the examiner is wrong about it being anticipated or obvious.
Exactly. Or you might argue that the prior art reference itself isn't enabling. Maybe the old publication didn't actually describe it well enough for someone to make it.
Okay. What else?
A huge one is claiming priority to an earlier filed application. If you filed, say, a provisional application under 35 U.S.C. Section 119E before that 1-year clock ran out from your first disclosure,
And your current application properly claims benefit of that provisional.
then you can use the provisional's filing date to overcome the Section 102B rejection based on the disclosure that happened less than a year before the provisional was filed. The same logic applies for claiming benefit of earlier non-provisional applications under Section 120.
So those earlier filings can be lifesavers. And you mentioned the MPP clarifies not to call an application claiming benefit of a divisional of it.
Right, just a small terminology point the MPEP makes, but good to be precise. You claim benefit under 119E, you don't file a divisional of a provisional.
Got it. Any other ways to overcome the rejection?
Well, you could also challenge whether the prior activity actually meets the definition. For instance, maybe what the examiner calls public use was actually legitimate experimental use, which has an exception. Or maybe an alleged offer for sale wasn't definite enough to count.
Let's dive a bit deeper into public use. We know Egbert showed even limited use counts. What else defines it? Does it have to be commercial?
Not necessarily purely commercial, although commercial use is a strong indicator. It really covers any use of the invention by someone other than the inventor who isn't under an obligation of secrecy and where the use isn't primarily experimental.
But what about internal use, like within a company?
That's where it gets interesting. The Invitrogen v. BioCrest case is important here. It suggested that even internal secret use within a company could qualify as a public use bar if that use was for commercial purposes, like using a secret process to make a product that was then sold.
So the commercial exploitation itself, even if the invention wasn't seen by the public, could trigger the bar.
That's the idea. The focus shifted slightly from pure public visibility to whether the invention was being commercially exploited before that critical date. It's a nuanced area.
Definitely. And what about the on-sale bar? What's the standard there?
The key case is Pfaff v. Wells Electronics. The Supreme Court set out a two-part test.
Okay, what are the two parts?
First, the invention must have been the subject of a commercial offer for sale more than a year before filing. It'd have to be a real commercial offer, not just, preliminary discussions.
And second?
Second, the invention must have been ready for patenting at the time of that offer.
Ready for patenting. What does that mean practically?
It generally means the invention was pretty much complete. Like you either had a working prototype or you had detailed drawings or descriptions sufficient to allow someone skilled in the art to actually make the invention. Proof of reduction to practice satisfies it, but isn't strictly required.
So if I had complete blueprints and I offered to sell devices based on those blueprints more than a year before filing, that could trigger the bar, even if I hadn't built one yet.
Yes, that's the scenario Pfaff addressed. If it was ready for patenting and commercially offered, the clock starts ticking.
Understood. And just to circle back quickly to the USPTO closures we mentioned,
Yes.
you said if the office is closed for a whole day, it's like a holiday for deadlines. That's covered in the regulations.
Yes, 37 CFR 1.9H covers those emergency closures. And just generally, 37 CFR 1.6A reminds us the USPPO isn't open for filing documents on Saturdays, Sundays, or federal holidays, so you always need to account for the actual business days when calculating that one-year deadline.
Okay, that's a really thorough breakdown of pre-AIA Section 102B and MPEP Section 2133. It really highlights how critical understanding that one-year window was and the different ways publication, use, sale, and inventor could start that clock.
Absolutely. It was a fundamental part of patent strategy under the old law. Hopefully, walking through it like this helps clarify those nuances, especially with the key court cases providing context.
It definitely does. The details matter so much here.
They really do. It's an area where seemingly small actions could have major consequences for patentability.
A very special thank you goes to Mike Shepard, the creative director who organized this project and made this entire audio series possible.
And we need to include our disclaimer. This summary of MPEP Section 2133, covering pre-AIA 35 U.S.C. Section 102B, was put together using AI tools like ChatGPT and NotebookLM. It might have errors or omissions.
Right. It's purely for educational and informational discussion. This isn't legal advice, and it's no substitute for the official MPEP itself, or talking to a qualified instructor or a registered patent practitioner.
Definitely consult the official sources or a professional for any real-world application.
So as we wrap up, what other parts of pre-AIA law, or maybe even the transition to the AIA, pique your interest? Are there specific scenarios involving this grace period that still seem complex?
It's worth thinking about how these concepts continue to resonate, even though the specific law has changed. The underlying principles about public disclosure and timeliness are still relevant.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And here's a thought to leave you with. Given how easily information spreads globally now, how might the territorial limits implicit in some of these older rules, like the focus on in this country for public use and sale, be challenged or reinterpreted in modern patent disputes? Something to think about.